Good morning, everyone. It gives a great pleasure to welcome our respected scholar, Professor Atanu Bhattacharya, on the behalf of the School of Languages and Literature Humanities at Nalanda University to this special lecture series on English language teaching. Today, we are privileged to host a scholar whose contributions to the field of language education have been both profound and far-reaching. Professor Bhattacharya is an eminent academic whose career spans over 2 decades, marked by rigorous scholarship, deep insights, and leaderships in the field of English studies. He holds a PhD in English from Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi, and a prestigious MA in ELT and Multimedia from the University of Warwick, UK, a testimony to his global and interdisciplinary academic grounding. Throughout his career, Professor Bhattacharya has held several prominent academic and administrative positions including Dean School of Language, Literature and Culture Studies at the Central University of Gujarat, Professor and Chairperson, Center for English Studies, Central University of Gujarat. His earlier academic journey includes contribution at H.M. Patel Institute of English Training and Research and Motilal Nehru College. In recognition of his excellence and commitment to advancing language education, Professor Bhattacharya has been the recipient of numerous professional awards and scholarships. His recent publication, ICT in English Language Education, Bridging the Teaching-Learning Divide in South Asia, published by Springer, and forthcoming works with Routledge and Liverpool University Press reflect the breadth of his research, from colonial education to science fiction in Bengal. Over the course of this lecture series, Professor Bhattacharya will guide us to the 5 rich and timely topics. First, fundamentals of ELT, exploring the field through the lens of South Asia history and current debates. Second, principles and approaches, a survey of key methods in ELT, including the rise of translanguaging and multilingual pedagogies. Third, technology in English language education, tracing the evolution of digital tools in ELT through both history and theory. Fourth, material production and insights from history, critically examining the role of instructional materials past and present. Fifth, research prospects and interactive session focused on new and emerging directions in ELT research. We are confident that these sessions will not only deepen our understandings of field but also inspire critical conversation among our students and scholars. Professor Bhattacharya's presence here is an immense honor for Nalanda University, and we are truly grateful for the opportunity to learn from you. So without further ado, please join us in the extending a warm and heartfelt welcome to Professor Bhattacharya. Thank you so much.
Yeah, am I audible? Yeah, it's fine. Yeah. So thank you for a very generous introduction, a very long one. But thank you, and thank you for inviting me over to Nalanda University. Thank you to Professor Sushant Mishra ji for having me over. And it's good to see a full class. It's very difficult to see a full class nowadays. So I'm really looking forward to your interactions during these 4 or 5 days that we are meeting. So I think I should give you an overview of what we are planning to do. So as I was saying earlier in our informal talk and conversation, इसको लगा हो जाए. And so what we're going to do is, as I'm sorry I didn't get your name, as Shalja pointed out, that we are going to have these 5 sessions. And these 5 sessions, remember, introduces ELT and its different forms of spread, dissemination, different uses, etc. But it's also important to remember that English language teaching doesn't exist in a vacuum, and or in any country for that matter internationally. English language teaching comes from a certain experience of learning English because of certain reasons. And I think it's important for us to understand that there is a history behind that. And the way we are teaching English, and I'm sure that if you meet your English teachers today, go back, English teachers always complain, okay? And they are very good at complaining. So they would simply tell you that, well, we teach, we keep on teaching, but people aren't learning English. There is still a large amount of deficit, for example, again in many countries, between what is known as, public schools and private schools, etc., etc., where it is assumed that public medium instruction is better than private medium, or in some countries public medium is better than the private ones, in some countries the private ones are better than the public ones, etc. So one needs to understand that in order to understand what we really need to get into for English language teaching, we also need to understand that there is all these debates that we have in English language teaching: how to teach, what to teach, what are the textbooks that need to be used in the classroom, what are the methods that need to be used in the classroom. There is also a 150 to 100-year-old debate behind what we are doing today. So what I am going to do is, for every topic that Shalja mentioned, we are going to look at a bit of a history behind that topic, because it, again, as I said, nothing in any discipline, and you are all doing world literatures, comes from a vacuum. It comes from a certain kind of a context, and we need to understand that context within which English was taught. Now, most of my examples, and this is where I am going to learn from you, most of my examples would come from areas that I know of. For example, I know a bit about Bangladesh, I know a bit about Nepal, I know a bit about Bhutan, and a bit about Pakistan, that's all. And of course, I know a little bit about India. But I am sure that I can learn quite a lot from you, because you come from a wide expanse of the globe, about English language education, English language teaching, importance of English language education, etc. Let me also start with a short caveat. Okay? Though we call it ELT, that is the most popular name that is given to the discipline, that English language teaching, nowadays the discipline would be designated as, you all right? You need some water? Nowadays the discipline is not, well, it is called ELT at certain points of time, but it is nowadays also called English language education, because English language education has wider connotation, a wider scope. Okay? It is not simply English language teaching anymore. So, it is not just the focus on teaching, but how English language education, for example, operated from historical times, mostly through the coming of the British Empire, to modern times, and what is happening along with English language education. This is the first caveat. So, instead of saying ELT, I might be using during my lectures ELE, so English language education. So, that is the acronym for it. The second caveat that I would like to again start right at the beginning is that when we talk about English language education, it is assumed that we are simply talking about English. Okay? Now, in multilingual countries, this is always a problem. If you are a monolingual country, it is kind of easy to slot that in a monolingual country, well, no country is a monolingual, we will come to that debate later, but let us assume that there is an assumed standardized monolingual form of language that is used in a country. Okay? Where English is taught, then it is kind of easy for us to say that English is taught over there as a second language or a foreign language, etc. Okay? So, for example, if English is taught in Japan, then English is not taught as something that is a part of the cultural expansion of Japan or a cultural history of Japan. English is taught as something that is required for certain needs. Okay? So, English is taught as a foreign language in Japan. If we talk about China, for example, again China is quite self-sufficient like Japan is in terms of doing most of their domestic or meeting most of their domestic needs with the Chinese language. Right? What they need English for is for a different purpose, and therefore, there are certain needs that are required for learning of English, and therefore English again is taught over there as a foreign language. Okay. But in multilingual countries like in India, it gets even more complicated, because when the students come to the classroom, remember that they might have already more than one language in their linguistic repertoire. Okay. So, what you have is, and I am sure that people who are from India would understand that when a child comes to the classroom in India, the child would know probably the local regional language, the home language that they use in the house, which might be different from the home regional language, the national language, which is Hindi, okay, and some smatterings of English, primarily due to social media or TV that they learn, etc. So, they already have the repertoire of 3 languages before they actually come to the classroom. English is being taught after that. Okay. So, obviously, when I am teaching English in Japan or when I am teaching English in China is very different from what I am doing in India, because you have children in the classroom who already have a big linguistic repertoire with them before they come to the class. So, this is the second caveat, and this is the debate that I thought I should point out between what should be done in multilingual classrooms. Okay. And it will be wonderful to listen to your responses to this when we come to that section, is that I am sure that you have come from schools or colleges where some of your experience would be something like use English all the time. That is how you are going to learn English. Okay. Do not use your mother tongue or home language, etc. Okay. And I am sure that many of these schools, and I came from one of these schools, I remember not very fondly actually, that we used to have these demerit cards. Okay. So, if you were caught talking in any other language than in English, for example, if you were talking in Hindi or in Bangla or many of the regional languages available in India, then you would be given demerit cards. If you get 3 demerit cards, then there was a fine, etc. So, the level of punishment kept on increasing until unless you kept on using English. But then, is it possible to deny that in a multilingual language, in a classroom where there are many languages available, would it be possible to teach English, or is it right to teach English by completely ignoring the language of the learner? So, can we really completely ignore it? Okay. Be it even if it is a monolingual classroom, even then would it be easy to completely ignore the language that children think in? Okay. And this is the second caveat that I would like to point out. So, when we say English language education, modern debates and modern scholarship shows, it has a large number of studies have been carried out to show that English language education cannot be separated and divorced from how you learn your own languages, okay, any language outside the classroom. And therefore, some of the methods that you use to learn your own languages can be carried forward, including the languages, into the classroom, and that probably helps the students. Okay. So, when we say English language education, I think we need to keep this in mind. We are not simply talking about English, we are also talking about the possibility of English interacting with other languages, and what does that interaction do. Okay. We will go to the third caveat and then we will come to the history. The third caveat that I would like to bring to your notice right at the beginning, we are going to do a session on this on the third day. What happens when, so this is all very ideal classroom situations that we are talking about. Okay. So, we are talking about a classroom where all students are there to learn English. Now, what happens after 2000? More or less that is the period when all of you, I mean I am guessing even if you are 34-year-old, I am guessing that you are, some of you are definitely Gen Z, okay, and you were born in digital technology. Okay. That is not the case with Shashank sir, or that is not the case with me. We were not born in digital technology. Okay. We kind of migrated to digital technology. Okay. And we can have lovely stories to tell you. I'm sure that many of you would not even imagine what world would have been like without your mobile phones. Okay. And I'm sure that everyone, and I'm sure that all of you have gone through this experience even during a class, and I'm sure that many of you have this urge to check your phone, okay, to see what is happening on the phone, because there's this constant urge to kind of respond to the digital, okay, as if the digital is calling you all the time. Okay. Now, in this kind of a situation where you are constantly, there is a different kind of a force that is available outside the classroom, okay? A different kind of a language platform that is available outside the classroom. How relevant are we as teachers to teach English or English language education? How relevant does it become? So, would it be possible, some people, some scholars do believe that it is possible that we don't need teachers in the classroom anymore. Okay? They would actually say that it would be better that students are left with computers and digital apps, and they would be able to learn on their own. And I'm sure that you know of apps like Duolingo, etc. Okay? Now, this is the third caveat, and this is another debate that we are going to look into as we go along. So, what is the impact of digital technologies in our own learning as an experience, and then learning of languages, generally speaking, when we are all surrounded by the digital. Okay. This is the third caveat. So, coming to the first part of today's conversation, what we are going to do is we are going to look at a bit of a history of language education first. So, as you notice, I am calling it language teachings, the beginnings. So, I am calling it language teachings, the beginnings. I am not calling it English language teaching at all. Okay? Because one of the things that we must realize that English language education comes from a history of language education across different sorts of understanding. So, I'll take examples from the West, what we call the West, and I'm putting it under quotes because it's very difficult to define what you mean by the West, but when I say the West, I am saying primarily the Anglophone West, West that uses English as a common language. And because this has an impact on how English language education developed over a period of time. So, many of these things that were done in language education in general, for example, in the teaching of Latin and Greek, were continued being used in English language education, okay, till today. So, there is a whole history behind that. Now, obviously, we will not be spending too much time in the very, very old past, but it is good to keep it in mind that there is a history of language education that was available before English language education came into existence. Okay. So, let us take a very quick survey of this history, and as you can see, I am taking 1500 year period, or more than that, maybe 2000 year period together. Okay. So, what was getting taught? So, when we said language education, what used to be taught in language? Now, if you take it from the classical to the 15th century, then along with language, you would also have logic. So, logic was an integral part of learning of languages, especially in the Greek and the Roman traditions. You had rhetoric. Now remember, language is primarily taught in the Greek and the Roman traditions, not for writing as such. I mean, of course, writing was there, but the focus was on speech, because the belief was for a very long time, at least till the 2nd to the 5th century AD, that languages needed to be learnt for oratory, okay, for giving speeches. Okay. And if you are a good orator, you need to learn what was known as rhetoric. Okay. So, rhetoric was absolutely essential. It was essential till about the 18th century, as we'll see, because the focus was on speech. So, the belief was that languages, the primary function of language is speech production. Writing, of course, is important, but writing comes later. So, during this period, the focus was on rhetoric for a very, very long time, and I am sure that in some of your English classes that you had done in your school, it is still taught. Okay? I am sure that you learned your figures of speech and etc. Yeah? So, that is a part of rhetoric. Yeah? Of course, philosophy was an important aspect, and this, as we will see later, was also an important aspect, as Sir pointed out in the morning. Not only in Nalanda, but also generally in Indian language education, classical Indian language education, it was an essential part. So, if you were to learn languages, you needed to learn the philosophy not only of languages, but philosophy of the general world. Okay. So, philosophy became an important aspect of language education during this period, and especially after Christianity started spreading across the European continents, theology becomes an important part. But remember, theology was in some form was also a part of the classical period. So, it is not that theology was not taught, but different forms of theological denominations were taught even during the early Greek, pre-Christian Greek and Roman times. Okay. Post-Christian Greek and post-Christian Roman Empire and post-Christian fall of the Roman Empire around the 5th century AD, till the 15th century, theology, primarily Christian theology, becomes an important aspect of language teaching again. Again, the belief is that language is something that is divine, and therefore, in order to understand the divinity of language, you need to understand the theological implications of that language. So, theology and language goes together. This is the general history from the classical to the 15th century. Now, all of you know, you are doing world literature, so you would know that around the 15th century, Europe primarily started changing. Okay? And we have the advent of something called the Renaissance. Okay? What did the Renaissance primarily do? Anyone who could tell me? What are the major principles of Renaissance, so to say? Humanism, okay.
The reintroduction of classical texts, Greek texts,
Okay.
primarily that came from Spanish.
Yeah, Spanish, Italian translations. Okay, good. So, one is of course this idea of humanism, and let me just expand on this brilliant answer, that it's humanism also, it's not simply humanism, right? It's also an expression of individuality. So, you have individual humanism. So, the individual as an important aspect of the social becomes important in Renaissance. Okay? Remember, before that it is more of a communitarian identity. So, you belong to a community. What Renaissance gives importance to is the idea of the individual, and therefore, along with Renaissance, remember, at the same time there is Reformation. So, the Reformation of the Christian Church also happens at the same time, where the focus again is on individuality. So, the individual has the capability to now read the religious texts, interpret them, etc., etc. Okay. Any other points of Renaissance? So, one is of course individual humanism. Any other? World literature students, you must have encountered, because 200 years later Goethe talks about world literatures. No? Okay, so the sonnet form, different kinds of forms that are taken from Italian, Spanish, etc. So different forms of genre division. Any idea about what is happening in language? So which languages are we going to be taught? Remember, before this it is mostly Greek and Latin.
German started
Okay.
kind of reformations and all.
So now you have the possibility of teaching regional languages, because see it's kind of related. Because you have individual humanism, you also respect the languages of the individual. Okay? And therefore, now you need a different method. Till now you have been teaching Greek and Latin till the 15th century. After the Renaissance, you now need a different method to teach, because now you are dealing with languages that for a long time are seen as derivative. They are seen as derivative as Greek and Latin.
Let me ask them, when was the first grammar written in any modern European languages?
Come on.
Talk about it.
1970.
1492, what is the relevance?
Oh yes. The full
Come on.
Not the book.
the full of the book.
Spanish.
Command.
No, not the book. The Spanish grammar was published in 1492.
Yeah.
Yeah.
First Spanish grammar in modern languages. It's one of the first comprehensive. But this I had talked in the context of ethic.
Yeah.
That is very important. This is important. You should know the modern language, not paper bull, but the edict of Vigat Coteret. Vigat Coteret is in French. This you should know. We have discussed. So they should
Yeah.
These two events are very important. The edict of Vigat Coteret and 1492. Just keep it as a date. 1456, 1492, these are very important years.
Thank you, sir. So now it's not simply, remember, that you need to write a grammar of Greek and Latin, right? You need a grammar of the languages, and as sir rightly points out, how do you create a grammar of a language which has not been officially taught? So you don't have a standardized version of the language. So this is also the period when standardization of many European languages start happening. Okay? And standardization, of course, carries a lot of other issues, but we will not get into that. But what we call standard Spanish or standard French, I think starts happening just after 15th century. So you have this standardization of languages that start happening, because in order to teach a language in a classroom, you need a standard version. Right? And in order to create a standard version, of course, you need the grammar of the language, etc., etc. And that becomes a part of language teaching. So what you will notice then is, during the Renaissance, these three become important. Okay. In some institutions, it is rhetoric is still there, philosophy is still there, etc. But education as a discipline becomes an important aspect during the Renaissance. So how do you educate? And all of you are doing world literatures, and I am sure that many of you are doing a part of it as English literature. And this entire debate, for example, that you have on Sydney. Okay. So when Sydney is saying that poetry is better, we should defend poetry, etc., etc., why is he bothered? Okay. He is bothered because he is worried that if he doesn't defend it, then English poetry cannot be taught as a part of the educational curriculum. English poetry will be banned from the educational curriculum. Okay. And therefore, he is defending it. And therefore, what you have is also the development of different genres of writing. Not simply English, for example, but also different forms that are borrowed from other places. So, you mentioned Petrarchan sonnet, for example, and many other forms. In fact, people say that, I'm sorry to say this, but Shakespeare is one of the greatest writers of English language, and anyone who does English literature is constantly told that Shakespeare is the person to go back to. But remember, in today's language and today's world, Shakespeare also would have been tried in courts for plagiarism. None of his plays, none, are original. Where does he get these stories from? All his stories are coming from Spanish, Italian, French, etc. Okay? Or translations from Latin and Greek, okay? Or imaginary histories. Okay? Plutarch's Lives, for example, is translated into English and then he uses them. Okay? So, what you have is this constant interchange, exchange between languages as Renaissance grows. And because there is an exchange of languages, what you have therefore is the possibility of thinking about educational pedagogy. How do we teach a language? So, what we have now, these debates, huge debates going on about how do you teach different sorts of languages. Grammar remains, because grammar becomes an important part. And as Sir pointed out, for example, not only Spanish, French, Italian I think comes a bit later in the 16th century, and English grammars, which are tried upon again in the 15th century. So, people are still trying to write the grammar of English. The problem is, in order to write a grammar, all of you know, all of you have studied grammar, right? So, when I say a noun, what does it mean?
That signifies some object.
So, I do not use the word noun generally in my everyday conversation. So, when I say a verb or an adverb or a preposition or whatever, all these words that I use to describe a part of language, grammar is the system of meta language, right? It is a system of meta language. It produces, creates a language in order to describe language. That is what grammar does, okay? And therefore, you need a meta language for grammar. So, for example, in the Indian tradition, one of the earliest texts of grammar is a text by Panini. I am sure that you have heard of it. So, Panini's Ashtadhyay is a meta-linguistic text.
Please write these also.
Oh, okay.
Many of them do not know Indian language.
All right. So, sorry. Sorry. ये वाला
उधर से
So, if you look at Panini, if you want the diacritical markers, then so it is pronounced as Panini, one of the earliest Sanskrit grammarians. Well, some people say it is not really a grammar of Sanskrit. He uses Sanskrit just as an example. It could be used for any language that you use. And in Panini, for example, there is a very common tradition of using meta languages. Panini does not use, if you read Panini, for example, it does not make any sense, because he is using this constant meta language to describe what is happening in language, and that is what grammars do. Now, in order to invent a meta language for a new language, for example, if I am teaching French, if I am teaching German, which are recent languages that I need to teach in the classroom now during Renaissance, I do not have a meta language. Right? So, where do I get it from? Latin and Greek. So, what I do is I model my language according to Latin and Greek models. Okay? So, I take Latin grammar or Greek grammar and then apply it to my language. That is what I do. Okay? This is exactly what English does later. In order to understand, so all these forms like noun, verb, adjective, adverb, etc., actually come from Latin and Greek models, which is now being questioned, but this was how language teaching began. So, you have existing models of grammar, you use that models to teach modern languages. Yeah? And of course, you have rhetoric. Classical languages, remember, are still taught. Remember, in universities, you do not have any regional language, absolutely no. because if you are a scholar, a Renaissance scholar, you need to know Latin and Greek. So, if you remember Ben Jonson, this contemporary of Shakespeare, so Shakespeare dies in 1616 and Ben Jonson writes an obituary for him. Okay. What does he say? He says this man had little Latin and less Greek, and I do not know how he still ended up writing these kind of plays. In other words, if you are a scholar, if you are an intellectual, then you needed to do Latin and Greek. Till the 19th century, 400 years down the line, in many of the universities across Europe, regional languages were not taught. So, if you are going to a university, you are supposed to learn the classical languages, not regional languages. Okay. There is again a whole debate on that. Let's not get into that. How are modern languages taught? They are mostly taught through translations. Okay. So, many of these translations that start happening in the Renaissance travel across countries, okay, and many of these translations are then used as what we call textbooks today. So, they become textbooks. Okay. So, collection of Boccaccio's Decameron gets translated into English, and then they are used, these stories are used in many of the, remember again not in universities, but in informal situations, informal classrooms, etc. Okay. Let us then move on to the next period, again very quick survey. Again you can see I am jumping quite a lot. Now, in 17th, 18th and 19th century, what starts happening is you still have grammar and education and rhetoric. Rhetoric actually makes a comeback in the 18th century, because in 18th century speech again assumes importance, primarily because you have a lot of political upheavals during this period. So, 17th and 18th century, huge amounts of political upheavals in Europe. Okay. So, if you go through the history of Europe, this is the period when what we call nation states start forming. The idea of a nation state, Italy as a different state from the larger European idea, France as a different state, Spain as a different state. So, this idea of a nation state also produces this idea of what we call modern politics, and in modern politics we know you need good speech. Okay. So, rhetoric kind of makes a comeback. And what also starts happening during this period is that there is an extensive use of grammar methods. So, languages are taught through grammar. Okay. What is your own experience of learning English or any other language for that matter? Was grammar an important part?
I have learned Sanskrit. That grammar was pretty much very important. Like the only thing.
Oh, in Sanskrit it is absolutely important, but there is a reason for that, but we will come to that later. Yeah.
That English, yes. So where I come from, we used to road
Do that
in grammar.
Yeah. So, you need to learn the rules of grammar and then you understand. Everyone's experience or no?
Yes.
Everyone learnt, you have a separate class for grammar, English grammar? Everyone?
We have separate classes, but in the same classes we used to have all the rules and regulations.
Okay, let me ask you a more important question. Did you have examinations on grammar? Did you have questions on grammar?
Yes.
In Taiwan, for example, one of the most toughest tests that they have is what we call the higher secondary over here. Okay, this is after 12 years of education, school education. It is one of the toughest tests, because if you do not pass that, you do not get into universities. And one paper of that test is actually a vocabulary list. You have to memorize 950 words, and any question from those 950 words can come. The grammatical conjunction, the way the word is formed, the way the word is used in sentences, etc. It is a very, very scary test. So, remember, grammar plays a very important role even today in learning languages. Okay?
Is that English or Chinese?
In English. So, I am talking about the English test here. And this is the period when grammar methods started evolving. Okay, so how do you teach grammar? So, there is a lot of debate during this period. What is the best way of teaching grammar? Now, we know that, to make it very simple, we have two basic methods of teaching grammars. For example, one is called the deductive and the other is called the inductive. Okay. What do these methods do? I will just write them down. So, you have the deductive method, you have the inductive method. So, what do these methods do? Deductive method is, for example, I give you an example of language. She goes to school every day. Okay. So, I give you a sentence and then I say, what is the time indicated by this sentence? What is the time? Now? No? She goes to school every day. It is general. You have learned the grammar. So, what I have taught you is what is known as habitual tense. Okay. So, it is talking about the past, present, the future. She actually goes to school in the past, she goes to school now, and she will go to school in the future. That's so it is called a habitual tense. Yeah. But if I change the sentence again, so what you are doing is you are looking at examples and you are deducing what the time indicated is. This the other way around, of course, is I tell you what the rule of the tense is. So, I tell you the past tense, the present tense, the future, actually there is no future tense, but anyway let us call it future tense. These are three tenses in English and I am going to teach you different parts of the tenses. So, you have in the past, for example, the past perfect, the past continuous perfect, etc., etc., etc. So, you have the perfective forms, etc., and then I give you examples on that. Okay. So, that is what, so you learn the rules first and then you come to the examples, and there is a lot of debate which is better. There are lots of debates on other thing also. One of the method that becomes extremely popular, which I am going to talk about in greater details tomorrow, is what is known as grammar translation method. Now, people generally misunderstand grammar translation method as something that happens in a lot in Indian classrooms, okay. South Asian classrooms maybe. So, people think that grammar translation is method is the teachers come, they take a text and then they translate it in the regional language and teach it, and I am sure that you have gone through this experience yourself. Okay. That is not the grammar translation method at all. Grammar translation method primarily is that you translate the grammatical rules of one language, for example, Latin and English. So, I teach you the grammatical rules in Latin and then you translate those rules not in language, but you try to understand how those rules are applicable in English. Which rules of Latin apply in English, which rules of Latin do not apply in English, what are the exceptions, what are the norms, etc. So, that is what the grammar translation method is. So, what I am doing is I am teaching you the grammar of English through the grammar of Latin, translating the grammar of Latin or translating the grammar of Greek, etc. So, that is what started developing during this period, especially in the 19th century. What happens in the next period, late 19th and early 20th century, you will see that there are three new additions now. Okay. The first realization, and this comes around the 20th century, I am going to share the PowerPoint with all of you, so do not worry about this. Yeah. The first thing is linguistics. Now, linguistics starts appearing as a discipline from the middle of the 19th century and really finds its bloom at the end and the beginning of the 20th century. Okay. So, linguistics, as you know, is the scientific study of languages, and I must emphasize the point scientific. Okay. So, linguistics sets itself up not as simply description of languages or grammar of languages or history of languages, but as a scientific study of languages. What do they mean, scientific study of languages? They say that it needs to have a certain kind of method. So, you need a method to understand languages. You cannot make random statements. Okay? You need to have data to understand how languages operate. So, this is also the period where there is a huge amount of collection of languages that starts happening. So, people start collecting spoken language, written language. People start thinking about how is spoken language different from written language. People start thinking in terms of what are the structures of language, how does language structure itself, etc. And this finally gives rise to all of you, again our world literature students, you would have seen some theory, and this gives rise to what is now called structuralism. Okay. So, this entire structuralist mode of understanding that everything has a structure, and we need to identify what those structures are scientifically is something that linguistics brings in. Remember, the so called founder of structuralism, Saussure, was himself a linguist. Okay. So, this is a new addition. So, you have scientific study of languages, and therefore, languages can now be understood in terms of different forms of structures, and then can be used to teach in the classroom. We will see some of this tomorrow. The second addition is psychology. Okay. People also start debating, and psychology is not a new subject, remember it is a very old discipline. It gets this modern avatar at this point of time. Okay. Not only because of Freud, because Freud actually is psychoanalysis, but the realization that human beings learn languages in different ways. Okay. So, it is not necessary that everyone learns the language in the same way first. Second, also a realization that many of the things that we do in any language, not only in English, but in any language, also comes from habit formation. Okay. So, there is a lot of habit in languages. Okay. For example, when you meet someone, I am guessing that you will say good morning or good afternoon or whatever. Okay. You do not really have to think. There are these formulas that you have in your head which you almost naturally use. If someone gives you something, you say thank you. Okay. So, these kind of language functions is psychologically built in within you. So, there is a lot of habit, and language can be taught as a habit. Okay. Well, again, so this is one psychological finding. The third thing is that in order to learn a language, there are lots of debates on this, but in order to learn language, you need to have some understanding of how languages function in a certain society. Okay. So, if I simply teach you the rules of grammar, okay, it does not automatically mean that you will be able to use those rules to use language in a certain given situation. Okay. It is like if I teach you the rules of driving a car in this classroom, it does not automatically translate into you actually going and driving a car. It is impossible. Okay. You will not be able to start the car even, probably, because you have learnt language theoretically, but how to use language in actual practical situations is still something that you need to negotiate with, need to struggle with. Okay. And that becomes an important finding of psychology, especially at the beginning of 20th century, that languages are learnt through struggle. Okay. So, there is this whole theory, again we are going to take this up tomorrow, but just as a kind of a teaser to what we are going to do tomorrow is there are theorists who say there are things like you cannot learn a language in a vacuum. So, if I keep a child inside a room right from the child's birth for 15 years or 20 years, the child will not learn a language, not because the child is inside the room, but because the child does not have any interaction. So, languages are learned through social interaction. Without social interaction, no language can be learned. Okay? You might learn the rules of the language, but you might not know how to use the language at all. Okay? So, these kind of findings start informing what we call language teaching, not only English, but general language teaching. Okay? Of course, it trickles down to language teaching. In the meantime, as you can see, this period and the period before this, there is a huge expansion of the European empire. Okay? Europeans have started traveling, remember. Okay? So, the Dutch, the Portuguese, the French, the Spanish, the British late entry, but the British, they have already started traveling across their own territories. Okay? When they have started traveling, and remember setting up colonies in these territories. Okay? Now, when they have started traveling, the thing that they also encounter is different kinds of languages. Just to give you an example of India, when remember the British have been here for a very long time. It's not that they only came in 1757 or whatever. They have been here trading since 1600, but they were restricted to very small places in India for a long period of time. Around the middle of the 18th century, the British get hold of a huge piece of land. Okay? And this happens, for example, with the Dutch in the 18th century. Okay? They capture a huge piece of land in Indonesia. Okay? This happens with the French, for example, who starts capturing parts of Africa. This happens with the Spanish, for example, who starts capturing what we now call the Latin American nations, okay, and the Portuguese, etc. So, now you have this massive pieces of land with indigenous populations, with indigenous languages, indigenous cultures, and how do you deal with them? Okay. And you have different reactions in different colonial situations. In India, they decide to learn. In many countries, unfortunately, they decide to annihilate and obliterate. Okay. So, local indigenous knowledge systems are gone. Okay. In India, well, probably fortunately, they decide to learn the languages. But remember, India has a huge amount of languages. So, what they decide to learn is mostly classical languages. When the British come to India, it is mostly Sanskrit, Arabic and Persian, because remember the Mughals are there. So, Persian is the official language, and these are the languages that they start learning. Once they encounter these languages, then they realize that there is also something that they need to do about their language teaching methods, because these languages have a different structure, these languages operate in a different way, these languages have a huge literature behind of their own, etc. So, how do you deal with that? And this gives rise to a huge amount of debates, especially around the 18th, 19th and 20th century in India. But remember, this is also the time that they need people who know some English in order to negotiate. Okay? They are here for a long time. So, they need people who also know English. And this is what happens in most of the South Asian countries. You take the examples of Sri Lanka, you take the example of Bangladesh or Nepal or Bhutan or Pakistan, present day Pakistan. What happens is that you need a kind of interpreters, okay, who know the language, and of course, they can't get all the officers from Britain. Just to give you an example, when the English, the British get their first big territory, big land in India, this is what we call modern day Bengal in the eastern part of the country. That piece of land included in those days Bengal, Bihar, Odisha, all eastern parts of the country and parts of Assam. If you take that entire volume of land, It's bigger than UK itself, just that. Okay. And of course, you have the indigenous population over there. So, you really can't deal with this huge territory just with British officers. So, you need Indians who need to learn English, and that is when English starts getting introduced in our system. Okay. And that is how most South Asians would have English, and English has become a prestige language, etc., etc. We'll come to that later. But I think it's important to understand that along with all this, there is also a huge history of colonialism that is associated with it. Okay. You really cannot have, you cannot think of English language education or English language teaching without thinking about the history of colonialism. Okay. And that, I think, should be kept in mind, and I will tell you a story at the end of the class as we go along. So, let us come to this. Before we come to this larger history, in Europe, I am sure that all of you know about International Phonetic Association, right? All of you use dictionaries and IPA. So, what does it do primarily?
It is how a word should be pronounced.
Okay. So, if you must have seen in dictionaries that there are these brackets.
So many of them may not know what is IPA, because there has been no
Oh.
course on linguistics.
Oh, there is no course of linguistics. Okay. So, there is something called, sorry. So, the International Phonetic Association, which is basically given this responsibility, okay, of standardizing pronunciations. This was the original responsibility. Of course, now they also look at variations, etc. So, if you go to any dictionary, you will see that beside the word there is something in the bracket, okay, which is basically a phonetic script, which tells you how the word is supposed to be pronounced. Nowadays, many dictionaries also provide variations of the word may be pronounced in different ways. Yeah? So, the American pronunciation might be different, the British pronunciation might be different, the Australian pronunciation might be different, etc. Okay? This is what International Phonetic Association does. So, I will tell you a story. In 1880, the end of the 19th century, the Phonetic Association had a meeting where for the first time they decided, they thought that, because remember there is a huge amount of languages that you need to teach now, okay? It is not only English. So, they decided, they had a massive convention, and they said that we need to come up with some sort of method when we are teaching so many languages where the European expansion has happened and they have encountered so many languages. Okay? And it was something of a revolutionary document that they provided. They were called the International Phonetic Association Articles. Okay? It was published in 1880. I will just give you an overview, it is a longish document. What did they suggest in the teaching of languages? For the first time, they are now talking about that in many of the countries that we have gone to, the language that we want to teach, for example, Spanish or Portuguese or French or English, should be considered as a second language, because there is a first language that many indigenous people of these countries have. There is still a problem, because International Phonetic Association considered only those languages that had a script. Remember, many of the indigenous languages did not have a script, okay? And many of these languages disappeared, unfortunately. But for the first time, what we have is that there is a focus on the second language instead of the first language. So, it's English cannot be taught to Indian students or South Asian students as a first language. It is a second language. Okay? The second thing that they proposed was that when we are teaching, why are we teaching, let's say, English to people? Are we teaching them to become great writers? Are we teaching them to become great critics? Or are we teaching them to equip themselves so that they can use English to do different kinds of jobs in daily life? Okay. For example, a Sri Lankan or an Indian or a Bangladeshi, when we are going to an English officer, I might need just a signature from him on an application. I don't really need to recite a poem by Shelley to get that signature, right? So what do we do then? Do we teach this archaic literature whose language is not going to be used anymore? I mean, no one speaks like Shakespeare. No one writes like Shakespeare. I mean, if you actually do, people will reject your whatever work, you know. So what do you do? Is the focus going to be on the spoken? So this is the second point that they mentioned, that the spoken language of everyday life should be brought into the classrooms, which is almost revolutionary of that time, because it was mostly, remember, languages were taught mostly as writing. What is your own experience of learning English in your early days? How did you begin? I always ask my students this question, sorry. By? Identification of what? Okay, all right. So how many of you started by writing A, B, C, D, etc.? Can we have a raise of hands? Everyone started by writing A, B, C, D when you learnt English? And all of you are aware that in English, the alphabetical forms are extremely problematic. All of you are aware of that, right? A is not A. A in ant is A. Okay. So, but why did you do it? Did you ever question the teacher? Of course, they were too small, but did you ever ask the question to the teacher that why are we learning alphabets? What is B in doubt? You don't say duped or dumped. C is even more problematic. C in initial position sometimes is pronounced as C. C can be pronounced as K. C can be pronounced as Ch. So why were we being taught writing? There is a reason for that. You were taught writing because originally English was primarily seen as something that can be used for written purposes. And this has been the tradition. I am surprised that many of you have gone still through that education where the focus is on identifying letters, okay? Because it was a part of a larger literacy philosophy. In order to be literate, in order to be called that you are literate, you needed to identify letters. Even today, when surveys are made, people who cannot sign their own names, as long as you can sign your own name, then you are literate. If you cannot, if you can just say your name, then you are not literate. Okay? Now, this focus on writing is something that comes down from the 18th and 19th centuries. Okay? IPA for the first time is saying no, the focus should be on the spoken language of everyday life, because that is what they need, etc. Yeah. The third point was, and this is the first time that they say that there needs to be a phonetic transcription, because there is a variation in language and therefore people need to know how they are pronounced, especially in foreign languages, okay? Because how many of you have done a certificate course in French, for example? Or any language? Japanese. In which language? Japanese? In German. Ah, okay. And you must have noticed that what is written is not exactly how it is pronounced. Right? Many of the words, for example, many of the letters or sounds, there is a structure, there is a rule to that, but for example in French, which are written, are not really part of the larger pronunciation. Yeah. So, the confusion between a written script is very typical of English, and therefore the International Phonetic Association promulgated the idea that if you are teaching a foreign language, you need to have a phonetic transcription, and phonetic transcription should be actually taught in the class. Okay? That is what they say. Again, you must have done this in your English classrooms, that most common phrases and idiomatic phrases must be used in the classroom, etc. You learn how the language is used, both idiomatically. You remember, idioms are formulas. If you learn idioms, you learn formulas. Okay? These are simply formulaic language, which you can use for different kinds of purposes. It's like greetings, good morning. Once you learn it, that's it. It's a formula. It doesn't really mean anything. So, it was raining very heavily yesterday, but I am sure that if you had met someone in the morning, you would have said good morning. You wouldn't have said, oh, look at the weather, it's a very bad morning, etc. So, these are formulaic forms. Yeah? And the focus was, again, use examples of language, grammar to be learned inductively. Yeah? So, the teaching of grammar becomes an inductive teaching. So, you do not teach rules of grammar. You give examples of languages, and students learn the rules from the examples, etc. Let me stand here. Now, they were a bit worried about translation. So, they would say that translation into native languages need to be avoided, but and the focus should be only on the target language that is getting taught. But later, of course, in another set of articles that they published in 1920s, they said that the local languages can be used, and they use the word judiciously. Okay? For example, when you are giving instructions in a classroom and the students do not understand the instructions, then it hinders the thing that you are trying to do. If you do not follow my instructions, then you will not be able to do what I want you to do. In those cases, judicious use of the native language can be made in the classroom. Finally, they said that first speaking, then writing. Okay? Though we still do not follow it, it seems that all of you studied writing first and then comes speaking. Okay? But IPA in 1880 had said first speaking, the spoken form, and then you move on to writing. Okay? That is what they suggested. So, moving on from here, if there are any questions, any queries, I will just pause a bit, because we are going to move into that story of colonialism. Any queries, please?
I don't have a question, but I just need to share something.
Go ahead.
Like when I was in school, we never had any separate grammar classes. While it was more like we were taught a lesson, and then it was application based. That we were just told that okay, this happens in this sentence, then how to apply it, and so I never learned the grammar like these rules, these names, but
that's very nice actually, because you were using the grammar translation but not strictly following the rules of the grammar translation, which is
more of inductive method.
Yeah,
Wherein
yeah.
I wanted to just give the specific examples and then go back to the rule that okay, you learned this rule, now this is what you have already applied. So
Now, even if the students learn the fact, for example, through these inductive methods, that the very structure of a sentence, let's say in Hindi, and the structure of a sentence in English are different. Because many of the errors that happen, for example, for people who come from Hindi medium backgrounds are primarily of the structure of a sentence. Okay, so in English, of course, it's the SVO generally. In Indian languages, most of them, it's the SOV. Yeah, so you have the verb that comes at the end. Now, even that realization can make children learn. So, that is what the IPA was saying, that you use it inductively, you give examples from your own languages possible. Remember, they were not promoting regional languages, but they said that if you give them enough examples, they would probably automatically learn the rule in a certain way. Yeah? Just to complete this story, in fact, there's been a lot of studies, psychological studies of children in a specific field of English language education called second language acquisition. So, it's called SLA, second language acquisition. How do children acquire language? And you'll be, and almost all studies have shown that English children who learn English as their home language, remember, when they are started learning the language, they will inevitably make two mistakes. If they don't make those two mistakes, they will not learn the language. Okay? The first mistake. Imagine a child standing near a window because the child's guardian has told the child that there is a party in the house and people are coming. So, when people are coming, let me know. Okay? So, the child is standing near the window. Okay? And he sees, let us say, 3 men or 3 women coming, and he shouts to his mother or father, "Mom, 3 mans are coming or 3 womens are coming." Okay. Now, remember, this is an exception in English grammar. Okay. If you generally add an S, it pluralizes the word, but there are irregular forms, okay, where words like man and women do not take the S. Yeah? The second mistake that a child always makes is the problem of the irregular verb. Okay? So, if the child had gone somewhere and the next day in the school, if the child is told that describe your experience of going to the circus, the child will inevitably say, "I goed to the circus yesterday," because again the general rule in English is if you add ed, it indicates a past action, but there are irregular forms. Okay? The child will learn it eventually. But initially, the child has actually mastered the general rule. The particular forms of rule will come later. Okay? And this is a part of this. So, that is the inductive method. So, you give enough examples. In fact, good parenting, people say, is not pointing out to the child that it is a mistake, but actually repeating what is the correct one. So, instead of saying, "Oh, you mean you went to the circus yesterday," and everyone keeps on repeating and the child kind of picks up, okay, go does not become goed, becomes went, etc. We will come to that again tomorrow when we discuss methods. Yeah. The deductive one, okay. So, the deductive is primarily I teach you the rules, I give you examples, huge amounts of examples, okay. For example, I give you a story. Imagine your own learning of English. Okay. it is sometimes called a mixed method, where your deductive and inductive are taught. The Australians don't agree. Australians say that grammar rules have to be taught. Okay, but sorry for the digression. A deductive is basically I give you a lot of examples, yeah, of language. Let's say I give you a story to read, a poem to read, etc. Sometimes I can even create materials for you. To give you a very concrete example, imagine that I am going to teach you the past continuous tense. Okay. So, what I do is, now remember, if you take a literature piece, then no literature piece will be completely in past continuous tense. They will be mixed, right. So, what I do is I give you, even from literature, I give you a passage which has quite a few past continuous, and then I ask you to tell me what time does it indicate. Okay. So, then you say it indicates, let us say, something that happened in the past, but it also indicates something that was happening in the past. Okay. So, an action that was continuing in the past, but probably has come to an end now. Okay. So, what I then say is, when I use, so after you have learned this concept, I can then introduce the rule of past continuous to you. Okay. So, you can have a past continuous with have been, had been, ing, etc. Okay. So, I introduce the rule later. I give you the examples first, then the rule. Sometimes in deductive methods, the rule is not even taught. The rule is almost, you deduce the rule, you find out what the rule is. Yeah? It's the opposite. So, what I do is I tell you the rule, and then I ask you to apply the rule to actual examples. Any other comment or questions? Interesting stories, I think.
When I was reading Hindi grammar, so we have this like Atanu.
Yeah.
I never understood that until I kind of understood the Sanskrit grammar. Then I understood that, okay.
Yeah.
So I think even Hindi has an imposition of Sanskrit grammar.
Of course. I mean, Hindi, remember, is something that becomes a standardized language only in the 19th century. Yeah? It's Bharatendu Harishchandra, and then the Nagrani Prachalini Sabha, etc. So, all these have an impact on standardizing Hindi.
What my question is, when we speak Hindi and the Hindi that we read of Bharatendu Harishchandra or Jayashankar Prasad, so that Hindi looks very much similar to Sanskrit.
Yeah.
The syntax, let's say, it's very much kind of
Yeah.
have this commonality also.
Yeah.
So is it same with English, where the spoken language is very different, where
Yeah.
when we converse in Hindi, it's very different, totally different from how we write it.
Yeah.
I still, because I've been writing in English for so many years, it's a challenge for me to write in Hindi, the prose.
Yeah.
Poetry maybe, but
Yeah.
prose is very challenging, and that too a kind of academic prose. So is it similar for
It is always different in any language. So, the spoken language, and that is something, there is a lot of studies in this recently. Previously, the assumption was you speak like you write, and therefore, writing was taught in the classrooms first. That is why you were learning alphabets, that is why you were learning how to write a sentence, etc. Because the assumption was there is no distinction, but they knew that there was a distinction, but the assumption was that if you learn writing, then you will automatically speak. Now, this is true of all languages. Any language that you take in the world, the spoken form is very different from the written form. It gets even more complicated in Hindi. In Hindi, the written form may be a standardized form that everyone uses, but the spoken form has huge amounts of variations. I am not even talking of them, some of them are almost languages. In fact, some people claim that they are languages. Mathli, for example. Yeah? Mathli, of course, had a script. अभी फिर से वापस आ रहा है क्या सर?
Now they are using 3-4 scripts.
अच्छा, they are using.
It had been used.
So Mathli script was lost. They adopted, so Sir comes from that region, people who are from Bihar would know, it's the northern, across the Ganges region, which had its own script, which is lost now. So the general script that they used was the Devanagari script that Hindi used. Okay. For some time they used the Bangla script also, I remember.
No.
In the 18th.
Mathli script itself is very close to that.
The Bangla,
Bangla, Assamese, Mathli, there
yeah,
are
yeah,
minimal differences. It was similar origins.
yeah, yeah.
Yes, siblings.
They are siblings. Okay. Yeah, yeah. The Hindi becomes even more problematic. So you have Mathli, Bhojpuri, Magahi. So you have so many different forms of Hindi which are spoken in different regions of the country. The Madhya Pradesh Hindi is very different, the spoken form. But we all assume that these are Hindi. Okay. So the spoken form can be very, very different. The question that you asked is about, is it, does it draw its grammar from Sanskrit? Almost all Indian languages do.
My question was, so is English kind of the written
Yes.
English based on Latin kind of writing? Because you see the syntax, so how we speak English and how we write English.
Yeah, I got the point. That is not true. I mean, there are Latin influences, of course, but remember, English evolved over a period of time through language contacts. Okay, so there are huge amounts of French influence, for example. So if you look at the history of England, there is this about 250 years when England is ruled by French kings, okay, the Norman kings. And there is a huge influx of French words. In fact, the joke is that when the meat is uncooked, then it is English. But once you cook it, it becomes French, because the English never knew how to cook. So any style of cooking comes from French, etc. So you can understand that. So there is a huge amount of intake that English has. So it draws from, of course, Latin and Greek origins, but it also draws heavily from Germanic, because it originally develops from the Germanic languages, especially the West Germanic, the West Highland Germanic languages that it draws from. Because of the invasions that happened in the 5th and the 6th century from the north, a large amount of Norse words, Norwegian, start entering English. There is a huge amount of influence of French, etc. So it becomes sort of, and of course later when it comes in contact with colonialism, with different languages, Bungalow, for example, in English, it's taken from India. Okay. So many of the words that you see, that we take for granted that is in English, actually draws from other languages. So it may not be true for English, but as such, the spoken and the written variety, they are different. So in English, you will have a kind of an amalgamation of different sorts of languages. Okay. So it's not necessarily always drawn from Latin and Greek, okay, because it is a secondary derivative. So English didn't draw directly from Latin and Greek. It actually drew from Germanic. Yeah. So that is why it's a secondary derivative. Yeah. Okay. So let me come to this story. How much time do we have, sir?
We have
About half an hour. Okay. So please do intervene, because otherwise it's going to become, everyone is going to start feeling sleepy and we won't have an interaction. So I'm sure that, so we have a lot of interventions from India, but I would love to hear your interventions from other parts of the largest South Asia, Southeast Asia, etc. So I'll give you a story now. So just to kind of, everyone loves listening to a story. So I'll give you the story. The British came in 1600s to what we now call the larger South Asia, started spreading their wings. By 1757, what happens is this. So what you now have, so this is a painting that was drawn by a British officer much later after the event took place, and this painting right now is in the British Museum. But so you can see the name of the painter at the bottom, Benjamin West, And this is an important event in the history of South Asia. I am not even talking about just India. Remember, at that point of time, of course, Bangladesh, Pakistan, they were not really seen as different parts. Okay, so this was part of the larger British Empire. And this, what happens during this period, very quickly, I do not want you to give me a whole story of the British possession of India. In 1757, there is a battle in the eastern part of India, and in that battle, the British defeat the governor of that region. Once that governor is defeated, the governor is actually has his allegiance to the central kings, who are called the Mughals. So the British say, we have defeated your governor, so we would like to have control of this piece of land. So the emperor at that point of time of India, by name emperor, didn't really have a big kingdom, but that emperor said, okay, I will give you this piece of land, and he gives them to the British. Okay. So this is called the grant of the Diwani. Okay. So Diwani is giving away of a piece of land. Yeah. So Diwan, I am sure that you have heard the word Diwan. Diwan is a person who generally has tract of land. So this land is given away to the British. That is the part of the history. Okay. Once this land is given, the problems that the British face is enormous. They do not know how really big this land is. Okay. Because remember, in empires, in very big empires, what tends to happen is the borders are always problematic, because sometimes the empire might have control over the border areas, sometimes those border areas might be taken away from others, etc. So we do not really know where the border ends and the other kingdom begins. Okay. And you have always border warfare. In fact, in Europe you have examples of wars going on for 200 years for borders. Okay. The War of the Roses, for example. So what then happens is the British need maps, okay, of the place. So they employ a large number of British officers to create maps of this region. Once they start making the maps, they say, okay, now we are going to introduce taxation, because we need money from this area to collect tax from this area. The problem is they can't send British officers, because the people who live in this area do not understand a word of English. Okay. So they will need people who can go and collect tax, but people who can use the local language to talk to the locals, but can also use English to talk to the British officers who are going to get the tax back. That brings us to the second problem that the British face, and that is, how do you do it very quickly? Okay. Remember, by this is very early, 1757, by 1848, the British have almost, if not conquered, but at least spread across the whole of South Asia, including Sri Lanka. The Dutch hand over the ports to the British by the beginning of the 19th century. Okay. What we are calling Bengal, the eastern part of the country, also includes Bangladesh at that point of time. So they almost control that entire region. Okay. But remember, this is a massive country. Okay. In order to get things moving very quickly, you need to introduce science and technology. So what they start doing is, what you see the pictures of, this is the first train that was used, the first engine that was used in the state of what we call Maharashtra today. Okay. So this train ran from Thane, small place, to Bombay. Okay. What did it carry? It carried cotton, because this region was very famous for cotton production. Now that cotton had to be brought to the ports so that they can be sent. And I am sure it's the same experience across the Asian, Southeast Asian. You go to, why was Hong Kong, for example, developed? Because China banned opium. They said the British cannot sell opium in their land. Okay? The emperor said that. So, where do you get, and the opium used to come from this region and UP. So, there are these regions which used to grow opium. Okay? Now, you have this massive production of opium, where are you going to take it? So, what you do is you carry the opium to Hong Kong and store it there and then smuggle it within the Chinese empire. Okay. That is why world literature's people would immediately recognize, why do you think in the 19th century so many people are talking about smoking opium? The Confessions of an Opium Eater. Why? Why is Coleridge writing Kubla Khan under the influence of opium? Where is this opium coming from? It is coming from India. It is all being traded illegally across, just like slaves are being traded illegally all across. So, there is a whole history to that. Okay? And in order to do that, you need fast transport, fast science and technology. So, of course, you have the railways, but you also have the telegraph. Okay? So, all these new forms of technology start entering. Now, because these technologies starts entering, they need, and this happens across Sri Lanka, it happens across many parts of Indonesia, where now new science and technology is seen as the new knowledge. In order to have new knowledge, you need to know the language in which the new knowledge is contained, because it is not contained in your languages. And therefore, again English enters through a different route. So, one is, of course, you need translators, interpreters. But the second thing is, if you want to be called modern, you are not to be considered modern until unless you learn the language of science and technology. And since science and technology in this massive region is contained only in English, you have to learn English. So, this is the second route through which English enters. Okay. The third one, of course, is by 1857 you have the establishment of big universities. Okay. Remember, these are not really universities that we understand universities to be today. They do not have departments. They are what are known as affiliating universities. Okay. So, the university is there, and then they will have different institutions who can take their degree from the universities, but the teaching will happen in these institutions. University will not teach you, it is only much later that these universities have their own departments. Okay. So, the first three that are established are now, of course, the city is called Kolkata, but Calcutta, the city Bombay is called Mumbai now, and the city Madras is called Chennai now. Okay. But all these three universities are established. What is going to be taught? Everything through English, all subjects. No other languages can be taught. For example, Sanskrit is taught in somebody this thing, but mostly if you need to have a modern education, all subjects have to be studied in English. And therefore, in order to get to a university, you need English even in schools. And that is how now English starts entering schools. Well, it is already there, but so it becomes a chain. So, in order to get any kind of an education, you need to be processed through the language of English. Okay? Right from your school days to your college days to your university days. And in order to get a job in the British government, of course, you need to know English. So, it becomes a language of access. So, if you want access to jobs, promotions, certain kind of respectability, then it becomes the language through which you need to climb up the social ladder. Now, I am telling you one side of the story. There is a lot of debates on this, but if you are interested, maybe at the end we will have a discussion on that. So, three things. One, the British have a huge piece of land, they need to administer that piece of land, and therefore they need people who need to know English. Second, the British are bring in this idea of science and technology as something that is modern, and since this modern science and technology is contained in English, you have to learn English in order to be called modern. The third branch, of course, is the educational one, but in order to be called educated or modern education, what we call it, it has to be through English. Okay? There is no other way. Now, this is all fine. The problem is, how do you teach it? Because English till now as a subject has not been taught even in the UK. That time, 1820s and 30s. Because English, remember, is still seen as not the language of education. So, if you remember Francis Bacon, this guy who wrote Novum Organum and the essays and all that. So, Francis Bacon in the 17th century, when he is writing about trivial things, he uses English. When he is writing about serious things, he uses Latin. You see? So, the language of learning is still Latin and Greek. People, of course, are writing in English, but you do not teach English because it is assumed that you will know English in UK. So, English as a subject is not taught, you do not need to teach it. Okay? But how do you teach at least 10 times the population of, if not more, of England, a language that does not have any teaching model at all? So, what do they do? The first thing they start doing is that they start setting up institutions. Okay? So, one is of course the universities, but much before the universities you also have, let me come to the next slide, you also have other kinds of institutions. Okay? So, I will go one by one. For example, this one is the first page of a new institution that is set up, and this is set up across South Asia wherever the British are. Okay? And you can see that there are some committee members over here. Okay? So, what is this committee? This committee is called the Calcutta School Book Society. Okay? Similarly, something called the Bombay School Book Society, this is set up in 1817, okay, very early. In 1818, in the city of Bombay, the Bombay School Book Society is set up. In 1819, the Madras School Book Society is set up. What are they supposed to do? They are supposed to produce textbooks. So, what we understand, I am sure that when you were in schools you still have textbooks, right? There is some reader or something, and there are some questions at the end of textbooks that you have to answer. This is where it all begins, because the British realize in order to teach a language in the classroom, you need something. And these textbook experiments begin at this point of time, which, remember, so I told you that nothing exists in a vacuum. So, the textbooks that you use today begins over here 200 years back. Okay. And this school book society has become extremely powerful. I am sure as students you might not be aware of it, but in every state, in every country, they have this textbook board which determines which textbooks to use, which textbooks not to use. You wanted to say something? to yeah. So you have to have a textbook board which determines what goes in, what goes out, what can be taught, what cannot be taught, etc. etc. And this is all where it begins. The second picture that you see over here, people who are from Bengal would be able to possibly identify it. This is called the Asiatic Society. Okay. The first president of Asiatic Society, who also has an immense influence on Sanskrit language and understanding of Sanskrit language, is someone called William Jones. Okay. William Jones actually is a judge of the Supreme Court, but he is also given this task of looking after Asiatic Society. What is the function of Asiatic Society? The Asiatic Society is supposed to translate knowledge that is available in local languages. Remember, not regional languages. They are not talking about translation from Hindi or Bhojpuri or all the other regional languages. These are mostly classical Indian languages from which knowledge has to be translated. Okay. And then that translation can be used for, again, use of teaching. Okay. You will be surprised to know, it is interesting. I should tell you a story to make you understand how the colonial this thing operated. So, all of you know that Abhigyanam Shakuntalam is translated. Yeah? One of the intellectuals of that period, a Bengali intellectual, requests the Asiatic Society that this is our own text and the students will be able to relate to their own texts, and since now a translation is available, we should teach this text in the classroom to teach English. The Asiatic Society, in a letter to this intellectual, his name is a big one, but let me just tell you, his name is Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar. So, shall I write that or no? So Vidyasagar is a major intellectual of this period. He is given a letter back saying that, sorry, this book is morally just unacceptable. Remember, it talks about having a child outside marriage at that point of time, and therefore it cannot be taught in the classrooms because it will spoil the morality of children. So remember, this is also what happened. That is what is happening. Yeah. Now, these institutions like Asiatic Society have a big role to play in this entire what we call translation project. So huge amounts of translations start happening during this period. The picture that you see over here is something that is again across South Asia. Along with the things that are happening in English, they also now say that we should also promote vernacular languages. Okay. Fine. So, what do you do to promote vernacular languages? Many of these people go out, and this happens, for example, hugely in present day Bangladesh. So, large number of folk tales and folk stories from Bangladesh are collected. Large amount of folk tales and folk stories from Bihar are collected. Okay. From Mithilasar, Grierson. So, Grierson is this big name. So, Grierson goes and collects these folk stories, folk songs, folk tales and puts them all together. Okay. Later they are translated into English, right? And then they are used as textbooks. But remember, many of them are censored if it becomes problematic. For example, just since sir is here, so Sushant sir will tell you, in the 1870s there is this person who carries out a linguistic survey of India, one of the first linguistic surveys that are carried out. So, this man, British officer called Grierson, comes to his region, okay, and he collects a large number of folk songs and folk stories and many things. One of the type of folk songs is called in Mithila Gari. Gari is abuse song, I mean literally translated. These are specifically songs sung by women during marriages to abuse the groom, to abuse the groom's, the to be father-in-law, to be mother-in-law, etc. So, these are called Gari songs, Gali, okay, in Hindi. So, songs of abuse primarily. Grierson completely refuses to translate them because they are really abusive, okay, and then sanitizes them. So, these kind of things start happening. So, this is the picture of something called a vernacular society. In, if you go to Bombay, it's still there, and they start collecting this folk knowledge. So, there is distinction between classical knowledge and folk knowledge, okay, which can then be translated and used in the classroom. So, another method of teaching English. Okay. The final one, and this is a story that I am going to end with, is a college that is founded in Calcutta called the College of East India Company, the EIC College. Okay. But I will come to that story later. I think at the end of this talk we will come to that story. But just keep this in mind. I would request you to keep this in mind because we will come back to this story. Okay. So, a very quick history of how English is introduced. You have the famous Lord Macaulay in 1835, who, so there is a big debate happening in India at that point of time, in South Asia. I shouldn't use the word India actually because it's not differentiated at that point of time in South Asia, because the British government has decided to give 100,000 rupees for education. Okay. Now remember, at that point of time 100,000 rupees is quite a lot of money. So, there is a big debate how the money should be used. So, there is a group of people who say the money should be used for teaching Sanskrit, Pali, Prakrit, other forms of earlier languages. There is another group of people who are saying that no, we should only teach English, nothing else. Okay. This debate comes to an end when this guy, Lord Macaulay, publishes a very famous minute of which becomes an act later called the India Education Act, and it is published in 1835, where he says that it is stupid to use government money, well not this language, but he basically says this, that we should not waste British government money to teach the natives their languages, because it is a waste of money. Instead, it is much better to teach them English, because then it will help us to grow our empire. He is very clear about the objective of teaching English. Why should we teach Indians English? Indians are South Asians. Remember, India at that point of time is a huge thing. Yeah? So, why should we teach them English? We should teach them English because we need their help. Okay? And without learning of English, they will not be able to do anything. Now, unfortunately, what has happened is people think that it is because of Macaulay that English has entered. Okay? But even after Macaulay says that English should be taught, should be made compulsory, and if you are going to ask for government money, your medium of instruction has to be English. So, if a school is asking for money, if a college is asking for money, if a university is asking for money, and you are using that money for teaching Indian languages or South Asian languages, the money will not be given to you. The only way you are going to get hold of that money is through English. Okay. This is the basis of this. So, based on this, there is someone called W. Adams. M.W. Adams. He produces a report in 1835 and later in 1838. And Adams' reports are interesting. They are all available on Google, so you can just click them and see them. Because Adams' reports are about earlier forms of education that existed in India, or in South Asia, and which are getting replaced by English education. Okay. So, he gives a long report on, for example, the Gurukul method of education, and he actually lists thousands of Gurukuls that exist in cities not far from here, cities like Kannauj and Banaras, including Lahore in present day Pakistan. There are huge amounts of Gurukuls where a traditional form of education is given. Now, because the British have made this, you do not have money and you need money for education, many of these Gurukuls closed down. By 1838, within 3 years, many of these Gurukuls are dead, or they have become English medium Gurukuls. English becomes a subject so that you can get money from the government. Similarly, many of the madrasas which were in existence start closing down. Okay. Again, primarily because there is no funding available. Okay. So, the earlier forms of education start disappearing, not completely, because that seems to be a myth, but they seem to kind of suffer quite a lot because of this new thrust of English education. Though it seems by 1854, about 20 years later, that there is a problem, because though Macaulay says that English should be taught, etc., Wood says that not many people have learnt English at all. Okay. So, he writes to the government and saying that it seems that we have pushed for English, but not many people have learnt English at all. They still seem to be more proficient in their own languages than in English. Okay. So, what do we do about it? Hunter, this is W. Hunter. So, the British government forms a commission in 1882 and says that, okay, what is the status of English in South Asia? And Hunter says it is terrible. So, this is 50 years after Macaulay's minute almost. Yeah? And he says it seems that all our money is being taken, but no one seems to be learning English at all. So, I do not really know what is happening. Okay? So, that is another interesting study. So, there is a lot of resistance, it seems, to learning English, but also by this time when Hunter Commission report comes out, the government is least interested in teaching English now, okay? Because they now see that English can be used as an instrument to fight against the British, because many of these early nationalists start writing in English against the British. Okay? So, they are not interested in teaching English anymore. In fact, they withdraw most of the funding, government funding, for teaching of English. So, it is a complete myth that the British really wanted us to learn English, not at all. After a point of time, they simply said it is much better that don't learn English, okay? And there is a complete withdrawal of funding after this. And this happens in 1904 when the Governor General of that point of time, Curzon, says that the Indian Universities Act very clearly states that universities can do whatever they wish to do, but if you are taking government money, then you will have to follow a certain curriculum. In fact, he is the one who comes up with what is known as the Sedition Act. So, if you say anything against the government, the British government, then you are in for trouble, okay? Leading even to death penalty. Okay? So, he says if you want money from the government, you need to go through the Indian Universities Act. He forms a committee, and he is very, very reluctant for the introduction of English as a subject in many of the colleges and universities. Okay. He says, you do not ask for money, we are not going to ask you questions, but if you are asking for money, then you have to follow a very rigorous procedure. Why did I tell you this history? Primarily because remember, all these historical incidents also determine how you teach English or how important English is, which we will come to tomorrow. So, that is the second part that we are going to look at tomorrow, etc. So, I promised you that I am going to tell you a story. So, before we come to the story, sorry. Remember, we are simply talking about the British Empire, but what we must also remember is that even before the British became an empire, there was a lot of missionary education. Okay? A large number of missionary from different denominations, mostly the Jesuits, who came into the South Asian continent, settled, and in many of their schools started teaching English. In fact, if you go to the northeastern section of this country, many of these Jesuits, which are presently the states of Nagaland, Mizoram, etc., set up English medium schools which imparted English. They used their major textbooks were drawn from the Bible, but they had a different method of education. So, it is not true that the British Empire started teaching English. The missionaries were there much before that. Okay? We should keep that in mind. There is also state directed education. As I said, the British wanted a certain kind of a state to keep control over education. You also have indigenous education, which survives till today. So, it is not that indigenous education completely disappears, and it is highly contested, including people who were trained in English would go back and say, we do not want this, because children do not, in rural villages, they really struggle with English. So, it is much better that we teach in their own languages, and maybe when they come to a later stage, they can learn English on their own, etc. Okay? So, there is a huge amount of indigenous education going on, including to the chagrin of the British government. Many of the British officers who are posted in this area start promoting indigenous education rather than English education. In fact, some of them, I will just give you one example called Mount Elphinstone, who is in the Bombay Presidency, now Mumbai. Elphinstone is the governor over there, and he says, I will give all this money for local language education. In fact, he promotes Marathi, the local language, rather than teaching of English. And the British government is not very happy, but can't do much about it. Okay? So, all these forms of contestations are also happening. And of course, there are huge amounts of local variations. We will not, if you are interested, we can go into that later. All of these lead to textbooks. So, what you have studied. Okay? We will have a different session on textbooks, so I am not spending too much time on this. Was there a classical education before this? I do not think we will have time to go through every one of this, but I will very quickly go through this. So, what was, for example, taught in Gurukuls before the British came in? Okay? And this will probably give you an idea. So, where language and knowledge are central. So, if you look at the early Gurukul systems, especially drawing from earlier knowledge systems. So, and if you look at the early texts of language education, then you see that language and knowledge are central. They are absolutely central. You cannot have knowledge without language, it is assumed. And therefore, this relationship between Shabda, which is word, Artha, which is meaning, and Brahman, which is the ultimate reality. So, these are taken for granted. So, you have the word, the meaning, and the ultimate reality needs to be understood in conjunction. Okay. And of course, you have huge branches of language education associated with this. For example, Pratishakyas are books of phonetics. Okay. So, Pratishakyas are very, very important texts in language education. So, you cannot learn a language. Remember, IPA talks about it in 1880. This has been there since the 4th century BC. So, Pratishakyas were specific texts that were meant for phonetic pronunciation, etc., phonetic teaching. Similarly, Vyakaranas, the texts, these for example, were specific grammar texts that needed to be understood. And of course, your interpretation text, how do you interpret a text, etc. Very quickly again going through this, for example, there was a lot of debate on what was linguistic change and variations. So, it is unfortunate that many of later scholarship has looked at earlier forms of Indian knowledge systems as something that is very rigid, that they did not talk about language change. That is not true at all. There are quite a few texts that talk about, for example, how language changes, undergoes variations. For example, Yakshas Nirukta is a very good example of that. There are also allegations against earlier forms of education that they simply talk about Sanskrit, nothing else. which is again not true, because in Panini's own text he actually talks about two kinds of language teaching or two kinds of language possibilities. One he calls Vediki, textual language. I think that answers a part of your question, written language. So that is something that is more formal, it needs to be taught in a different way. But he also talks about Bhasha, which is variations of the spoken form. Okay, that is also so the word that he uses is loka vyavhara. Loka vyavhara is as used by the people, that's what it means. And of course, there are different theories of interpretation of language that is taught. So, you have Karaka theories, Photo theory, Mimamsa. I have just listed 3, but you have a whole history of Buddhist theories of interpretation. Okay. So, for example, Apoha, Shunya, etc. Okay. And that is also taught in many of these earlier schools. What were the books that were used in this earlier forms? Now, again taking examples from Panini. So, he says that there are 3 kinds of books that should be used for language education. One he calls the Prokta. So, Prokta are basically compositions of others, okay, someone else who has composed the text. Krita are mostly poetic compositions and stories, akhayikas, okay, small stories, short stories. And Vyakhyana, texts of commentary. So, these 3 kinds of things must be taught for teaching of languages. Okay. Texts by others, stories and poetry, and commentary. And I am sure that your own learning of English has happened through these 3. So, you have poetry, you have stories, and you have commentaries. Okay. So, it is important to understand that this also is a system that gets replaced by what we call modern English education. So, let me come to the story now, and I will end over here today. All of us believe that English came and taught us English. Okay. They were not interested. They wanted to teach their own people. As I told you, when they first came and owned this huge piece of land, they suddenly realized that they need to train officers who can administer this piece of land. Okay. So, in a small place in Calcutta, which is called Fort William, not so small, they established a college to train officers. Okay. And this college is the picture that if you remember that picture. So, this was what was established. As you can see, it is a very small college, but the English officers who were supposed to administer this land would come and get trained. So, this was a training, officers training college. Okay. It came into existence in 1800 and it died in 1854. We have exact dates of its death and its existence. Okay. So, as you can see, around 54 odd years, but though the college lost its importance after the 1830s, because by that time in England there was also already an officers training college that was established. This is another interesting story of English language education. Okay. So, we imagine that English language education is only for South Asians or for us. Okay. It is not true actually. Why did they want to establish this college? And I would like you to read this and then we can have a 5 or 10 minute discussion. Okay. I will just read it out so that everyone. So, one of the things that they realized was to establish in their minds such solid foundations of industry, prudence, integrity and religion as should effectually guard them against those temptations and corruptions with which the nature of the climate and the peculiar depravity of the people of India will surround and assail them at every station. Okay. So, one of the things that, remember, huge pieces of land, these are kids who are sent to India, 16-year-old, 17-year-old English, Irish, Scottish men, 19-year-old, they come over here, go to collect taxes, someone gives them a bribe, they are more than happy, and they become rich and richer and richer and richer. they get a salary of 60 rupees per month, which is quite a big salary at that point of time. But by the time they go back to England, they have huge amounts of money and they can buy palaces. So people are, this East India Company suddenly realized there are huge amounts of corrupt practices going on. So you need a teachers training college for temptations and corruptions that Indians are giving them. Okay? Reason 2. It has been justly observed that all the merits of the civil servants are to be ascribed to their own character, talents and exertions, while their defects must be imputed to the constitution and practice of the service. Okay? So, you have to create this cadre of officers who need to be morally trained, okay? Characters, talents, etc. Third, professional service. The early discipline of the service should be calculated to counteract the defects of the climate and the vices of the people, and to form a natural barrier against habitual indolence, dissipation and licentious indulgence. The spirit of emulation in honourable and useful pursuits, etc. Okay, I am not going to read the whole thing. So, as you can see, the English officers, it is not their fault, it is the fault of the people, Indians, and the fault of the climate, because the climate naturally makes you feel to be corrupt, and therefore, they need to be guarded against that. Okay. The fourth reason, and this is an important one. Their vocation should be founded in a general knowledge of those branches of literature and science which form the basis of the education of persons destined to similar occupations in Europe. To this foundation should be added an intimate acquaintance with the history, languages, customs and manners of the people of India. Okay. So, there is a realization now that it is not simply the languages or education of languages that is important, but also an engagement with local customs, traditions, cultures, etc. Okay? And this becomes the basis of English language education in India or in South Asia. So, it is not simply, well, literature and science becomes important subjects in teaching of English, but also the idea that it has to interact with local cultures, customs, etc., okay, which can be regulated. If you feel that local cultures and customs are not to the British moral taste, you can always censor them. But otherwise, this is the model that the British Empire spreads wherever English is taught. And this model is perfected over here in a certain sense. So, be it in Sri Lanka, be it in Bangladesh, be it in Bhutan, everywhere where English is taught, or Indonesia, this is the model. Interact with the local languages, but also language of literature, language of science becomes the vehicle for carrying of the language. Yeah. Thank you. I know it is a long one, but I will stop. But we can have interactions here. So, I am sure that there will be some questions, but for tomorrow I would like you to read something, but also come prepared, because I would like you to, we will have to rearrange this a bit, because I would like you to sit in small groups, okay? And I would like you to do a few things, because we get into the crux of English language teaching now after this introductory form. Yeah? Any comments or questions? Thank you. Yes.
Because maybe we are analyzing world literature beyond
Yeah,
this,
yeah,
and it
yeah.
has not this kind of historical
Yeah.
development of how language
Yeah,
is
plays an important role.
used.
Yeah, yeah.
In one of the books written by Vishek Martha, I remember that history of, I don't remember, but the literature of India.
Yeah, history of Indian literature. Yeah.
So he prepares this background first and gives this idea of meta and profane. I remember, like he
Yeah.
said that how to say, they first introduce
Of course, and it is, see, important to understand, and this is a recognition that we all need to have, because at some point of time I'm sure that some of you will go back and, let's say, join a college or university. So historical sensitivity is absolutely important to understand how things operate. Otherwise, what tends to happen is, if I simply come and tell you, for example, that these are the methods of teaching English. Now, these methods have a history, and therefore it's important to understand and making a choice. So when you make a choice on a method, you must also be aware of where it stands vis-a-vis. So there are issues involved with certain kinds of methods. We'll talk about some of them, but just to kind of preempt what I'm going to do tomorrow. So one of the methods, for example, were used for training soldiers, because they needed to learn language very quickly. And the same method was used in the teaching of English. So we must be aware that, well, this might be working with soldiers, but might not be working with my children, because they are not going to become soldiers. Okay?
When they were making it, was there any kind of lexical work? Because, for example,
Oh, yes.
commerce.
Yeah.
So in India, the situation or understanding of commerce would be different from
Yes,
British.
yes.
So they must have different words from Persian or Sanskrit,
Yeah,
whatever.
yeah.
So how did they kind of
In fact, you'll be surprised to know that this college, East India College, the officers who were sent to train over here were supposed to learn 28 subjects. Okay. Many of them were Indian languages. I am not carrying the list, but if you want, I can show them to you tomorrow. Let me see if I have it, but so sorry. Just to give you an idea of what was getting taught. Yeah? These were the subjects that they were supposed to learn. These are all in the original document, yeah, so you will not be able to understand some of these spellings. So this is of course Sanskrit. So you don't have a separate thing called Hindi, in those days Hindustani. Bengali, Telinga is Telugu, Marathi, Tamil, Kannada. Now remember, they are not supposed to learn all these languages. Depending on where they are posted, they will be taught this language. Okay? And of course, all these other things. In modern languages of Europe, they would learn Greek, Latin and English classics. Okay? And of course, history and astronomy and all sorts of things. Okay? So these are 28 subjects that they were supposed to learn to become officers. Okay? Now the problem is, how do you teach them? Because they have no experience of teaching local languages. And that is where English language teaching becomes interesting in South Asia. Because you are teaching first of all English, which has never been taught before in formal situations, and you are teaching local languages which they have no idea about. So what do you do then? So they are constantly fumbling around and trying to find a way out. And this happens everywhere in all of South Asia. In Sri Lanka, they really mess up. They don't, I'm sure that you know the history of English language education in Sri Lanka. Ask your friends. So they really mess up, because other than Tamil and Sinhala, they also have problems of wiping out the earlier Dutch presence. what do you do? So English language education kind of is still learning on its way. It's a very new discipline. It's not like Greek and Latin or Sanskrit, which has a huge tradition of teaching. It's a very new discipline, and that's why I said that it's better that we learn from each other rather than, so it seems at times that nothing works, at times it seems something works, etc. So it's probably good to understand. For example, European languages have a long history of not only in terms of languages, but also in terms of language teaching. Okay. English is very new to the area. It's something that we are still struggling with.
But at the same time, it's kind of a global language.
Yes, this is a global language.
It's very imposed to everything.
Yeah,
We
yeah.
are talking about world literature
Yeah,
in Anglophone.
yeah,
So it's kind of very
yeah,
contradictory.
yeah,
It's,
yeah.
how they very interesting.
In fact, I'll tell you a very interesting debate. You know, one of the debates was in the 80s and 90s. Sir will remember, and this debate was about should we have Indian writers in English curriculum. Okay. There's a big debate, especially Indian writers who were translated from the original language, so translated into English. And I still remember there was this professor who in one of the conferences during this thing, he said, I don't understand what this debate is about. I mean, you read your Cervantes in English, it was not written in English. You read your Homer in English, you read your Russian books in English. So what is the problem with Indian writers writing in their own language and getting translated? So this debate, I think, is also an important debate, not only in terms of world literatures, but also in terms of how do we treat a language at a certain point of time. You know. And English, remember the teaching of English was a colonial thing. It was not taught in England. In fact, the first time English is introduced as a subject is at the beginning of the 20th century in England. Not before that, it is not even taught in England. So they are struggling constantly with people who have different languages, different cultures, different contexts, and to deal with that.
I had one question. You said that at that point of time there was no system of teaching English to English people. What about America? You were talking about in Britain.
Yeah,
What
yeah.
about in America?
In America, remember when the universities are set up at the earlier points of time. So some of the oldest universities in America, like Harvard, etc. English is introduced only in the 19th century. That is not because they don't know English, but because in the 19th century in America there is a huge amount of immigration from other countries. Okay. For example, the Irish potato famine in 1840 forces a large number of Irish peasants who do not have formal education to move into America and settle down in and around New York. Yeah? Now, these people use remember the Irish dialectal form is very different from what we do in standard English. So they need to be trained in English, and therefore it's only in the 19th century. A large number of Czech, for example, at the beginning of the 20th century, a large number of diasporic Jews, for example, moved to America, primarily because of different sorts of things, the history. And because they start moving, during the Mexican-Californian conflict, a large amount of Spanish-speaking Mexicans moved to America, etc. So America becomes this land of immigration, and therefore you need a standardized language to be taught. And it's interesting, therefore, one of the methods that actually develops in America, it's called the direct method. So where it is said that the mother tongue cannot be used in the classroom at all. They completely ban the mother tongue, especially in Texas and so the southern part of America, where there is a huge amount of Spanish immigration, Mexican immigration. Yeah? And they realize that they use both the languages, and it's a problem. So depending on where English is taught, the cultural context does play an important role in how it is taught. Okay? So they call it mother tongue interference, which research has shown there is nothing called mother tongue interference. So American scholars call it that if you use your mother tongue, it is going to interfere in your learning of English. That should not happen. But in America, it's around 19th century that it begins, but it's because of immigration again. In many of the European nations, it's much later, teaching of English. France, I think only recently, maybe not even now. Spain, I am not very sure. Argentina, I am not very sure. It's there. I think English is there.
As in secondary school,
Ah.
public school, secondary school, as an option of second language, English and French.
English and French.
That exists in entire Europe.
Yeah, but it's
But
not.
there is no
like-
method, etc. They are not worked.
Okay. All right. I think everyone is hungry, sir.
I think then we should stop.
Yeah. Right.